Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. On January 3rd, the United States swept into Venezuela in an operation that was characterized by the Trump White House as not an invasion, but an arrest to bring President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores to New York to be tried for allegedly committing narco-terrorism and importing cocaine. It was a mission that was carried out by elite Army Delta Force commandos with more than 150 military aircraft and has been called the largest American military action of its kind in years. It resulted in more than 80 deaths and with U.S. service members injured as well. But its wake has left Venezuela, in essence, leaderless, and while some Venezuelans, both there and here, cheer the removal of the dictator Maduro, with Donald Trump saying he's going to run the country and turn over its huge oil industry to American companies, Venezuela's future is quite up in the air, and other Latin American countries fear they could be next. Tonight we have two outstanding experts with us to help sort it out. Please join me in welcoming a Lehman College professor who has worked in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer and was the director of the National Security Council in the White House, and has some eye-opening details about the background behind the American invasion of Venezuela. It is Professor Joaquin Monserrate. Professor, nice to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we have an author with us who is a highly decorated professor of Africana, Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx studies at the University at Albany. It is Dr. Gabriel Hetland. Dr. Hetland, nice to have you with us, sir.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Professor Monserrate, there is much to say here and much to cover. You wrote an op-ed piece for the Puerto Rican newspaper El Nuevo Dia that the original motivation for the U.S. actions was not because of Maduro's alleged operations as a drug trafficker, but something else entirely. And that, you claim, was what inspired Donald Trump to say that Venezuela and Maduro himself will pay an incalculable price. What was that? What did you see? What did you learn? And what is your, in essence, your thought on why this ultimately happened?
I mean, you rule out reasons why the U.S. went so aggressively on Venezuela at a time when most of the MAGA world seemed very, very reluctant to get involved internationally at every level. The thrust, the direction of this administration seems to be very domestic. So the drugs argument made no sense whatsoever, because I mean it's a well-known fact that the cocaine that comes out of Colombia via Venezuela is really aimed at Europe. That's really where it heads. There's a small amount that goes to the U.S., but most of it, overwhelming majority, over 90%, goes through the Central America and Mexico. So that made no sense. So one thing that President Trump kept repeating and emphasizing was the issue of migration. The fact that Stephen Miller, the White House advisor, who single-mindedly focused on migration, participated in all these meetings, made me deduct, or suspect at least, that was really what the administration was pursuing. We have last September the protection, the migratory protection for. We have about 300,000 to 500,000 Venezuelans in the U.S. Their temporary protected status was lifted, was not renewed as it had been year after year last September. So that leaves them in a, let's say, deportable status. And the fact that President Trump kept repeating this and making points about migration in his late night tweets made many of us suspect that that was one of the key objectives of the administration.
So
I mean, yeah.
let me just ask. So what you wrote about in that op-ed piece is that President Trump wanted to deport many, if not all, of the Venezuelans who were migrants to Venezuela, and they rejected that offer. And that's what you had written about. That's what motivated the president to say, "Well, okay, you're not going to do it. We'll do something else," and we'll, as Trump is wont to do, he says, "If you don't do what I say, you're going to pay a price."
I mean, it's a very much a domestic, not an international agenda. It seems clearly the fact that the oil thing. It's all about affordability and prices. There is an international component, but I've been tracking the domestic angle of it very closely.
You're about to put out a piece that alleges that Maduro was betrayed by his own people. That is a fascinating concept, because the United States said we had spies on the ground, and they really told us what went on with Maduro, and that's how we captured him. But your allegation is that it was almost an inside job, that there's a syndicate in there in Venezuela, and that's why the U.S. was able to go in so stealthily and pull Maduro out.
I mean, it just all points that way, and it seems clear from the very beginning that the only ones who were not in on this negotiation were Maduro and his wife, and the Cuban, call it Praetorian Guard, that has been protecting the Venezuelan president since Chavez times, and in fact, so I was not surprised to see that the big part of the casualties on the other side were Cubans.
Dr. Hetland, thank you for joining us. What now in Venezuela? So, on one hand, the president all of a sudden said that he would support the vice president as the leader, and now all of a sudden the person who is trying to overthrow the Maduro regime is all of a sudden becoming a friend to Donald Trump, and there is chaos in the streets. What do you know? What do you hear about what's going on in Venezuela?
Yeah. I mean, I've been calling this a regime change without a change of regime. And that speaks to the fact that they, kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and left the rest of the regime basically intact. So Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is now the acting president of Venezuela. The same secretary or defense secretary, Pedrino, is still there. The Interior Ministry, Diosdado Cabello, who's very powerful. So the Venezuelan state is largely intact and similar to what it was, 12 days ago, before any of the operation took place. But we do have a different situation, of course. Donald Trump has made comments about running Venezuela. Marco Rubio has sort of clarified that. There was a New York Times op-ed or headline, a week or so ago that said Rubio stresses U.S. plan to coerce rather than govern Venezuela. And there does seem to be a lot of pressure from the U.S. government for the Rodriguez administration to basically do whatever the U.S. government wants. What's somewhat ironic is that what the U.S. government wants is similar to what Rodriguez herself would want and what most of the Venezuelan leadership would want, and actually very similar to what Nicolas Maduro would have wanted. They wanted to be doing business with U.S. oil companies. They wanted to be doing much more business with the U.S. overall. And so the economic changes that are indeed being coercively forced upon Venezuela are not entirely unwanted by the Venezuelan leadership. But there's a lot of questions. I think it's been surprisingly calm within Venezuela, although, of course, the repressive apparatus that was existing under Nicolas Maduro has not gone away, and there's some evidence that there's been increased repression this week. It appears that Donald Trump is joining in with that. And then there's the question of Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. I will point out that there's been significant criticism of that within the world. I mean, Corina Machado does not have a long-standing record of supporting peace, so we can leave that off to the side. But what was remarkable in the press conference on January 3rd was that Trump explicitly said that Machado doesn't have the respect within Venezuela to govern, and threw her to the side. There is a meeting now between Machado and Trump scheduled for this Thursday in the White House. Machado has said that she will give Trump her Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee has said that's not allowed officially. So, it's kind of uncertain what exactly will come out of that. But I think that it's unlikely that Trump will actually give, leadership abilities or leadership positions to Machado in this moment, because I believe the real reason they went with Rodriguez was for the question of stability. They want continuity within Venezuela, and this is very important for oil companies in particular. Although Trump has been talking over and over and over again about oil and the oil question within Venezuela, there has been reluctance by a number of the US so-called oil majors. Exxon in particular has said that Venezuela is quote unquote uninvestable. Trump got pissed about that and said that he's going to disinvite them from going into Venezuela. But there's a lot of reluctance by oil companies to plunge tens of billions of dollars. Estimates say it could take over $100 billion to get the Venezuelan industry back and running following, mismanagement, as well as very, very punishing US sanctions for, close to a decade now. So there's been a real dilapidation of the Venezuelan oil industry. It's going to take massive investment to get it back up and running. And so there's just all sorts of contradictory things going on within Venezuela right now. And if Machado came in, it would really destabilize the situation. So I think they want to continue a lot of the continuity.
The whole notion of regime change in other places has not really worked out for the United States. The goal in the old days was to bring democracy so that the people could select who they wanted to run the country. What you just said was basically Trump is thrilled with the current regime, so to speak. It has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with getting the Venezuelan people a chance to have their own voice, but really more what Trump's agenda is for oil and whatever else he's got in his mind. Do I have that right, Dr. Hetland?
Yeah, I would say I'm not sure Trump is totally thrilled with the Venezuelan government, but I think that he's prioritizing the question of stability. And I would say other people around him more than Trump himself. But I absolutely think that the question of democracy is not on the agenda whatsoever. It's stunning that the word democracy didn't appear in the press conference on Saturday, January 3rd. Nobody uttered it once. And it's really not a priority whatsoever for the Trump administration. So he may or may not be thrilled with the current leadership, but he's very much willing to work with them. And he would be very happy if the current leadership was able to provide the conditions for significant investment by U.S. oil companies.
Professor Monserrate, just one question about the oil, and then I want to get both of you to let's talk about the notion of other Latin American countries, specifically Cuba, and how it would be affected. But I just want you to let us know what you think about this whole question of oil. Is that what Trump's motivation is?
I think you need to keep reminding yourself that there is a very, very strong domestic agenda in this, and that's the price of oil. You cannot separate that from the affordability issue that's putting the midterms, the Republican Party against the wall, as we saw in New York City. It is an issue that resonates very, very strongly. In fact, today President Trump is in Detroit talking about not Venezuela, not oil, about the economy. So I think that's where the oil angle is. The thing is, it doesn't resonate because oil is we're still under $3 a gallon in most places. There is a surplus of oil. Exxon is doing very, very well in Guyana. Venezuela has a lot of oil, but there is no, the demand for oil is not necessarily needed. Exxon is in no rush to go back to Venezuela. It's owed about 10-20 billion dollars by the Venezuelan government, that it's won in arbitration from the takeovers, of the 2010s. So, I mean,
Yeah, it
it,
just
it,
doesn't
it,
really
it
make sense. And you brought up the notion of affordability. I'm not an expert in it, but I don't see how that is going to change the price of oil in the United States for the foreseeable future. It's kind of a separate thing. I want to spend a little time on the notion of other countries. Obviously, Marco Rubio has had significant interest in Cuba. So we'll start with you, Professor Monserrate. Um, how much, quote unquote, in danger are those countries? And that includes Colombia and Mexico. That's a much larger question as well. But let's just start with Cuba. Are they in danger? Do you foresee Marco Rubio doing a similar thing in Cuba? And then,
I mean,
Dr. Hetland, you're going to get the same thing.
Cuba's gonna come. I mean, Venezuela provides about 30% of the oil in Cuba. It's gonna come. It's gonna be much harder. It's already facing significant shortages of oil because Venezuela just can't produce enough. Um, Other countries will be affected. Russia and China, eh, will. I mean, will be affected from the lack of that supply. China does. You make use of the sanctioned Venezuelan oil. As we saw, one of the shipping containers that was the very last one that was seized was Russian flagged. Um, so I doubt that Cuba, as long as Mexico can keep supplying, Mexico has become the major supplier of oil to Cuba above Venezuela. As long as Mexico can keep supplying it, I think it will be able to at least to weather the
Weather the
immediate
storm.
future.
Yeah. Dr. Hetland, I know you have strong feelings about it. What are your thoughts about Cuba and potentially even Mexico? But let's just start with Cuba. Do you think they're gonna do the same kind of thing in Cuba and regime change, for want of a better term?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of points we can make here that Marco Rubio has his eye on Cuba for a very, very long time. I think he would love to change the regime within Cuba. But I think Professor Montserrat is correct that there's somewhat contradictory reports this week. I mean, Trump was saying Cuba's ready to fall. There's statements by Trump and Rubio about, telling Venezuela they have to stop utterly having any economic relationship with Cuba, any strategic relationship with Cuba, as well as some other countries. But then there's more recent reports saying that Mexico will be continuing its shipments to Cuba. The oil that Venezuela has provided for Cuba has been very important, not just for the energy needs of Cuba, but also for its fiscal balance. Cuba has taken much of that oil from Venezuela and sold it on the open market and then used the hard currency for all sorts of other uses. So, there will be a blow to Cuba undoubtedly by any cutoff of Venezuelan oil, which seems very, very likely. It seems like it's happening now. But it does appear that Cuba may be able to weather the storm. And then the most recent reports suggest that the US government may not be in full agreement about wanting to topple the regime in Cuba. I think that, speaking of other Latin American countries, this is a very destabilizing situation. I mean, Trump was making very aggressive statements about Colombia, about its president, Gustavo Petro. That seems to have calmed down with a phone call that happened on Wednesday last week between Petro and Trump. It doesn't appear there's any imminent threat, but I think that the example of Venezuela to all of Latin America and to some extent the entire world will be if you don't do what we say, you better watch out. And I think that for better or worse, there's some credibility to that. Although the situation in Venezuela was particular, it was specific. There's reports about the very weak and not entirely up to snuff Venezuelan military capacity. So I don't think that they can take for granted that they would be tactically and operationally successful in other countries. But it's a very dynamic situation.
It's a dynamic situation, and what you gentlemen have underscored is that if, in fact, which so many Americans believe, that Trump is in this because he wants to build the United States oil power, so to speak, it may not be happening. And so, what really is the agenda, or what is the result of this, other than a significant amount of chaos? I mean, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, who are led by leftists, so-called leftists, criticized the seizure, and yet, Argentina, El Salvador, and Ecuador were thrilled with President Trump. Are any of them going to do anything? We'll start with you, Dr. Hetland. Are any of them going to do anything to deal with this, or they're just going to watch how it plays out? Like, do you see any either aggressive action or diplomatic action from any of those countries at this particular time? Or they're just going to say, well, let's just watch what goes on here?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of, diplomatic building that's going on between Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil in particular. We've already seen some reports of Mexico having a military buildup on the U.S. border. So I think one, somewhat unanticipated consequence of this could be that Latin American militaries will actually be sort of building up, and that might take place by Latin American countries that are most wary of the United States in places like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And I think that, what is behind this, if it's not oil, I think the domestic stuff that Professor Monserrate's pointing to is very important indeed. I also think that there's a real project of hemispheric dominance. And this is pretty open by the Trump administration, the discussion of the Monroe Doctrine, the so-called Dunroe Doctrine. I think that has to do with the conflict with China and the U.S. desire to control strategic resources, including oil, and basically keep great rivals such as Russia, China, Iran out of the Western Hemisphere overall. But I also think that the U.S. won't just be able to dominate Latin America. I think that, there will be nationalist and anti-imperialist blowback from the U.S. sort of imperial overreach, and it could actually benefit certain candidates from leftist and nationalist political forces. So, and that's happened in the past in Latin America. Even this year, Lula was boosted in popularity when Trump came after him and threatened Brazil with 50% tariffs, partly because of what the judiciary in Brazil was doing, enforcing some procedures against Jair Bolsonaro, the somewhat disgraced and jailed ex-president. And that helped Lula. So I think that, Trump's desire to dominate in the Western Hemisphere might not actually work out the way he thinks it will.
I want to ask a related question to Professor Monserrate. It's just ironic because I was in the elevator coming down to do the show, and I live at a top floor, and the elevator takes a while. A neighbor came in, saw that I was getting ready to do the show, asked me what the show is about. Long story short, and I told him what we was about, and his comment to me was, it would be great if the United States could control the Western Hemisphere. And I was like, whoa, that's quite a statement. Professor Monserrate, this whole notion of American imperialism, which now has a new view, can it be successful in a large scale in Latin America? Or is this just, never really going to happen, and it's too complex to think that the U.S. could go, piece by piece and amass all these controls?
I mean, as Gabriel mentioned, this definitely has an impact and sets a precedent and we're seeing it in Iran right now, right? Venezuela, the impact, it's being the same sort of playbook is being laid out over as far as Iran. So I mean, it does have an influence. We're seeing the center right becoming more popular in the Americas. I would credit Bukele as much as Trump for that. We're seeing it in Chile. We're going to see elections in Colombia this year, and I guarantee you, center right will come to power. Honduras, and so that more than the military effect has an influence. But I'll tell you, Gary, that the ones that benefit the most from this Don Row doctrine are China and Russia, because in as much as the U.S. can claim ownership of its neighbors, that's precisely the point that China and Russia have been making as it comes to Eastern Europe, particularly the former Soviet Union
Right.
and the East China Sea, um, for respectively. So, I mean, I think we will see a significant effect, not just in the Western Hemisphere,
But even,
from
I just want to, because we're running out of time, so I'll give each of you 30 seconds to just sum up. What do you think is going to happen? We'll start with you, Professor Monserrate, and we'll give Dr. Hetland the final word.
you know, I mentioned this. This has an international component, but it has a very domestic component, and I'm really tracking to see how much how much wind Rubio gets out of this in terms of succession, and how Vance reacts to this. Vance is interesting.
Got it.
Interestingly, Vance's meeting was given the Greenland side, so
So
he's
what
going to
you're
come
saying
after
is, yeah,
Europe.
they're both looking at 2028 is what your point is. Dr. Hetland,
Correct.
just you got about 30 seconds. What's your final conclusion here?
I mean, I think that overall, there's a lot of critique within Latin America. You mentioned Brazil, Colombia, Spain has also joined in a critique of this. And so I think there's concern amongst the world, frankly, that the US has flagrantly violated international law and the US is just going to try to do whatever it wants. I think there's also concerns domestically that, there's US forces in ICE and elsewhere who are also not necessarily abiding by the laws. So I think there's a broad sense of crisis and of a sort of possibility of unrestrained power. And I think we'll have to see if there are, pushback to that both domestically but also internationally within Latin America, within the EU.
Got it.
Are there going to be forces that can constrain the Trump administration and sort of, try to put a halt to its project of
Got,
Western hemispheric domination?
got it. Gentlemen, we can't thank you enough for joining us. Professor Joaquin Monserrate from Lehman College and former State Department official, and Dr. Gabriel Hetland from SUNY Albany. Thank you so much for providing expertise for us. And that'll conclude the program. We thank our producer, who is Ray Pagnucco, and of course, all the people who work on our crew, and to you too, the people of the Bronx. We'll see you next week. Our guest will be Councilmember Eric Dinowitz. Different subject.